I don't know a pastor that doesn't hate to preach about money. It's not my favorite subject. It really isn't. Oh, there are some pastors out there are some preachers out there that love to preach about money. I know one preacher that more than 60% of his sermons, more than 60%, were about money. I know a religion that their holy text has about 500 verses about prayer and about 500 verses about faith, but more than 2,000 verses about money or possessions or what people do with it. Can you imagine? That preacher, he sounds like a televangelist, doesn't he? And that preacher was Jesus. Jesus told 43 parables, and 27 of them had to do with money and possessions. And that holy script I was talking about, well, that's the Bible. Why do you suppose that is? Why this heavy emphasis on money? What would you venture that the guess is? The reason is. Maybe it has something to do with another saying of Jesus. Where your treasure is, there will your heart be also. Anybody priced season tickets to the Chiefs? And what I love about that is that doesn't include the parking. I mean, if you want to go to every home game, it's going to cost you a small fortune. There's a commercial now that's on that it shows all these different scenes, and it talks about, I think it's for a credit card, about them helping you with this and helping you with that. And one of the scenes is they show a football stadium and they say, help you find your religion. Where your money is, where your treasure is, there will your heart be also. I heard a comedian the other day say that putting the name of God on our money in this country was redundant. Because most of Americans worship money. Money is their God. And he was being pretty cynical, but maybe not too far from the truth. I had a district superintendent say that the reason he tithed was not to feel more spiritual, was not to feel holier than thou, but to loosen just a little bit the grip of greed on his heart. Possessions. Possessions, things, resources. They're powerful incentives. And have always been powerful incentives in every culture at every time, but maybe even more so in our world today, in our consumer society. And that brings us to the widow. Just before Jesus sees this woman dropping this money into the offering, he has just been telling his disciples and everybody around who could hear him that they shouldn't be like the scribes who put on all these religious airs and want everybody to respect them, but turn right around and devour widows' homes. And you have to wonder if Jesus didn't know that this woman who was putting these 2 copper coins, the equivalent of 4 pennies, into this treasury, if he didn't know that everything else she had been devoured by the lawyers, by the greedy people who already possessed everything anyway. And I have to tell you that I don't think our culture is any different than that. The scribes are still among us. And the widows' homes are still being devoured. In fact, a lot of people's homes were devoured in the last few years. How could 4 cents be more than all the money that all these rich people were putting in? In 1997, just about this time of year, Ted Turner, y'all know who Ted Turner is? Started CNN. Was married to Jane Fonda for a while. Ted announced that he was giving $1 billion to the United Nations. All that money would be used for relief agencies and for special services of the United Nations. None of it could go for administrative services. And that's a wonderful thing. That's an incredible thing. Don't hear me wrong here. I'm not putting Ted down, okay? But after Ted gave the $1 billion, you know how much money he still had left? $2 billion. You know, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation is doing incredible work. Incredible work. It's amazing what they're doing. But even after all the money that Bill and Melinda have given away, they hardly count as poor. This widow gave everything that she had. And you could argue, well, so what? What can you do with 4 cents? I mean, it probably wouldn't even have bought her one meal. But that's the way you think you're missing the point. Her trust, her full trust, even in such poverty, was in her God. It has been in my experience, in more than 30 years of ministry, that the most generous people I have ever met were poor. Literally willing to give people the shirt off the back. To share with somebody else the very last meal they had. Someone who could barely keep a roof over their head, taking in and sheltering someone who was homeless. That's the kind of generosity that God expects from His people. And for a very good reason. That is the kind of generosity that God has demonstrated to us. God didn't give us a third of what he had, or 2/3 of what he had, or even 9/10 of what he had. Rick Warren and his wife, they give, you know who Rick Warren is? The Purpose-Driven Life pastor out on the West Coast. Always wears Hawaiian shirts. I like that about him. Rick and his wife give a reverse tithe. They give 90% of their income and live on 10%. Now, they also have one of the best-selling books of all time out there. But God didn't give us even 90%. God gave us himself. In the passage that we heard from 2 Corinthians, Paul points this out. Christ, who had everything in heaven, emptied himself, became one of us, not to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for us. That's 100%, folks. That's 100%. We talk a lot about the tithe, 10%. There's stuff on that red card about the tithe. Well, the way some of the Pharisees understood the tithe was you gave 10% of everything you had 3 times a year. It gives you a little different perspective on that. I know people that if they gave 10% of their income, they'd have to choose between eating or having electricity. And I don't think that's what God is asking us. I also know people that if they're only giving 10%, they're being incredibly stingy. Because God has given them so much. So each one of us has to be in prayer with God about what it is that we can give. But understand this. You can give without loving. But you cannot love without giving. And it's important that we understand that if we are going to do justice in this world, if we are going to love mercy in this world, if we are going to walk humbly with our God, then we must be a generous people. I'm going to tell you a little secret. God doesn't need anything that you and I have. Any more than God needed those 2 little copper coins that widow put in that offering plate. Any more than God needed whatever it was that the church in Corinth was going to give to the church in Jerusalem to aid them in their time of need. As the psalmist said, God owns the cattle on 1,000 hills. Well, actually, he owns all the cattle on all the hills. And that's the point. The reason that God seeks anything from us is for our benefit, not for God's. There was a story in the study book this week. John Wesley was a student. One night the custodian stopped by his room and they talked for a while. It was a cold night. And as their conversation ended, Wesley commented that the man should get himself a better coat, a heavier coat, that the coat that he was wearing was too thin. And the custodian said, "This is the only coat I have, and I thank God for it." This led Wesley to think, and he asked the man, "Would you have enough money for food if you don't have enough money for clothing?" And the man said, "Today I've only had water, and I thank God for the water I've had." Wesley was a little taken aback, and he thought about ending the conversation, and so he said, "Well, you need to go home to a warm bed." And the man said, "I thank God for the dry floor that I'll sleep on tonight." And Wesley said, "You thank God even though you don't have clothes to wear or food to eat or a warm place to sleep? What else do you thank God for?" And the man said, "I thank God for the gift of life and for the heart to love Him and for the deep desire to serve Him." Wesley wrote in his journal that he would never forget this custodian because he had shown him that there was something in religion to which I am a stranger. Later, after Wesley himself had his heart strangely warmed, he would tell his followers, "Make all you can. Save all you can. Give all you can." When Wesley died, even though he had made a small fortune from his pamphlets and books, he had less than 50 pounds to his name because he had given it all away. Most of the time we would hope that somebody who had the desire to give would follow up on that and actually give. But Paul turns that thinking upside down with the church in Corinth. He tells them, not only do I want you to give, but I also want you to have the desire to give. You can give without love, but you cannot love without giving. This card asks us, are you ready to grow one or more steps in your giving? And by one or more steps, they're talking about a percent increase, percent of your income increase. Be honest when you answer this. Be truthful with yourself, and God knows. I'm not going to look at this one. Financial secretary will, but I won't. The possibilities are no, I'm not. Or yes, I am. And in either case, it asks for the next year to give an estimate of your giving And then there's an optional checklist at the bottom. This is a tithe. This is a certain percent of my or our income. In the year ahead, with God's help, we will step up toward tithing. Don't check the one that says send information about a monthly draft from my checking account, because we don't have the capability to do that. But there on the very right side, giving will be a priority in my life. Growing to include the following. Giving will be the greatest joy in life. If I miss a week, I will give twice as much on the next week to keep faith with this commitment. I will move closer to tithing each year. The check to the church will be the first one I write each month. What is a faithful commitment between you and God? Maybe more than 10% or less than 10%. Whatever that is, that's a tithe as far as I'm concerned. Give this prayerful consideration. And as we close this service with our final hymn, please, if you're ready, drop that card in that box. In Jesus' name.